Thank you, Alan. Okay, our next reader is Neasa MacErlean, who is a member of several of our book clubs, and we knew Neasa from coming and going. Little did we know there was also a book on the back burner, and that was published earlier this year, and it is called Telling the Truth is Dangerous. And Neasa is the granddaughter of Robert Dudley Edwards, who, along with Moody, I think were probably the two major historians of modern Ireland, working from the 1930s, which was just after the Civil War, and history required a rigour that wasn't really given to it, because it's a lot easier to describe it in an emotional, on-the-hoof kind of manner when you're involved in a conflict. But they were the first people to examine the sources and say, well, you have to prove what you say rather than just say it, however eloquently or vehemently. And the book is a fascinating look at how that was done. And it's also a family story. And Neasa doesn't hold back on that either. So good for her. Please welcome Neasa MacErlean.
Thank you. I think I'd better get this bit over and done with first, Vinny, which is I've never met Michael D. Higgins.
We can ring him up.
Yeah.
We can FaceTime.
Yes, FaceTime. Yeah. My book was published. Telling the Truth is Dangerous just under 3 months ago, and I didn't think it would be overtaken by events so quickly. But it becomes truer by the day that telling the truth is dangerous. You can just ask Jimmy Kimmel, the American comedian who's just been banned by Disney for talking about saying what he thought was true. You can ask the British politicians who stayed silent this week as Donald Trump came over and they couldn't talk about Gaza and many other issues. I'll be reading a few excerpts from the book as well. I think Ireland is a very good place to be in this difficult world. Sorry about the sort of sombre tone here. But in this difficult world, it's a good place to be. It's better than the US, clearly. It's better than Britain. I was back in Canterbury last week where I used to live for 25 years and was quite shocked by what's happening there. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about that in a minute. But one of the ways I think that we can preserve hold things together in our own minds during this time is to have a clear view of reality, and that often comes from having a clear view of history, because your expectations are based on the past, and you can see that in Gaza and Ukraine and so many other places at the moment. What is history is one of the themes of this book, and Robert Dudley Edwards, my grandfather, was, as Vinny was saying, one of the architects of the scientific revolution of history, and one of his definitions of it, or how he described the purposes of it, was to break down prejudices which have survived from the past. And he talks about between neighbouring communities, the perpetuation of disagreement is only too often due to misreading the past, or perhaps to continuing to believe in war propaganda. And you can see this in Gaza and Israel now, for instance. His great friend, Professor Herbert Butterfield, spoke at Dudley's invitation in the Shelburne Hotel in Dublin in 1945. They were very worried that war would break out again. It was just stopping, but there was so much potential conflict still there. And he picked up similar themes to Dudley's. He said, "Nothing is more futile than merely to blame the foreigner and to rail at his wickedness, when somewhere or other there is involved also an intellectual incapacity of our own." Both Dudley and Herbert Butterfield very much admired a man who'd been in Buchenwald concentration camp for 13 months. to survive 13 months in a concentration camp is to survive 4 times as long as you were expected to live in one of those places. He was a very strong man, and he was Pieter Geyl, Professor of Modern History at Utrecht, and he was particularly highly regarded after the Second World War because of this deep, awful personal experience of what had happened under the Nazis. And he talked about the way that history had been written until then was on a kind of British formula, which was there was an arc of progress going up, and it was a Protestant British arc of progress. But once 53 million people had died in the war, and once we had the incinerators in the concentration camps, we couldn't call it progress anymore. And so that's why Dudley and people like Pieter Geyl were changing the way that history was written from many more perspectives after that. And Pieter Geyl described the kind of British history that had been written as exclusively and intolerantly English. And you can look to America now, where the syllabuses are being changed in schools. You can look to Russia, where the syllabuses are being changed in schools in history, and they're becoming exclusively and intolerantly Russian or Trumpian, or however you define them. So what are the effects of not telling the truth, either in history or in the present? If I could just give you 2 quotes from the book. There's a very broad-minded Israeli historian called Yuval Noah Harari, who says, most wars in history are not about food or territory. They are about the stories that we imagine in our own minds. And so imagine again, Gaza, what are the Israelis, or not all the Israelis, sorry, but Netanyahu and his government, what are they imagining? Clearly they're imagining that they own Gaza. What's Donald Trump and Smotrich and the Israeli government imagining when they're talking about dividing up the profits from the real estate in Gaza at the moment, where they've imagined that they're entitled to that land? That's how history can change the course of the present. There's another person I quote in the book, who's a British politician, who talks about the way that politicians use blame and how they get that from historians. Blame is a very useful weapon, obviously, in politics. And Brendan Donnelly says, where have the politicians got their sense of blame from? They've got it from historians, even if the politicians haven't read a historical text. It's the historians who've kept going the blame narrative. Now, not all historians by any means use blame all the time. And one of the ones who didn't was Robert Dudley Edwards, and one of the great examples of that was his book that he edited, The Great Famine, the first big book to come out about the famine, and he didn't want to point the finger of blame at the British or whoever you could point it at, because what he wanted to do was to get at the dozens of reasons that had caused that, so that we could understand and stop it happening again. One of Dudley's favourite quotes on history comes from Napoleon, and it's, history is a set of lies agreed upon. I heard some of those lies last week when I was in Kent, and I went back to see my old friends in Canterbury, one of the most beautiful cities in England, and just 10 miles down the road there's another ancient town called Faversham. And down there are wandering many evenings, maybe now, groups of anti-migrant protesters going along to a special asylum for refugees there. They're not your normal refugees because they're minors. The typical person staying there is a 14-year-old Afghani who's been sent away from his family to try to survive abroad. And these guys are marching down the road wearing balaclavas and doing the fascist salute and saying Sie Heil. So this is where we've got to, I'm afraid, even in the Garden of Kent, as it's called. So, but I think our understanding of history could still keep us able to look in the mirror over here. We're doing relatively well, I think, in Ireland, certainly when you compare us to America and the UK. Telling the truth is probably the only way that we can retain our self-respect when you look in the mirror each day, to tell the truth even if it's dangerous. And there was a quote that I heard about just after I'd written the book. You're not always alone if you're telling the truth. There was a Spanish quote which is being used a lot at the moment, because we're celebrating 50 years since the death of Franco, and since that time Spaniards have been able to speak the truth more, and that quote is, "Truth unites those that seek it." Thank you.
Thank you, Neasa. And that is dangerous, which is becoming more topical.
Thank you.
Our next reader is Anne Rindy.
That's great.